What's up, guys? This is Nick from Arch City Poker, and in today's video, I'm going to be continuing the poker hand review series with today's video, as always, recently covering one no limit hold'em hand and one PLO hand. So, in this first hand, let's get right into it. My villain is under the gun and decides to open for 4x in a live 2-5 game. He has me covered. Stacks are effectively about $650 right now. He goes ahead and raises, player in between us folds, and I decide to 3-bet to $65 with red pocket kings. I think that's very standard. I think too many players slow play big pairs like this. You need to be 3-betting more often than not. This is how you get the most value out of this hand. You also essentially bloat the pot early in position, and that's going to really favor you most of the time with this specific combo especially. So my opponent goes ahead and calls. He is a good hand reader, definitely has improved tremendously with his no-limit game, so I do respect him, and I think I will play a little more of a balanced strategy with him post-flop than I would with a lot of opponents. I think I'd be very exploitative against most of the players in this player pool, but against this player in particular, I think that I need to be a little more balanced. And the flop comes 10-7-5 with two hearts, so my overpair is looking pretty good on this flop. I think I definitely have the range advantage, having all the overpairs, definitely having top set in my range. I think he can have potentially all the sets, but I do think that I have the overall advantage due to the fact that I just do have all the overpairs. He could have some jacks in there, maybe pocket queens. I think that may go ahead and 4-bet, but I do think he could have some other combos that are simply stuff like pocket nines, something like maybe 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited. So I do expect him to continue a good amount of the time on this flop, but if we want to talk about sizing here, I think that you can go a different, you can go with a few different sizings. I prefer half pot on these boards that tend to have a little bit more of a dynamic run out more often than not, meaning that the nuts will change on the turn and river more often than not. So he goes ahead and checks, and I do go ahead and fire half pot, and he calls. Turns a 4 spades, and he checks. Now, I want to go back to the flop real quick and talk about this is not just an auto c-bet. I do think that to balance my range, I talked about wanting to play a little more balanced against this opponent. I think that I definitely need to have some stuff like kings and queens in my check-back range. Definitely, let's see what Snowy says. I would say probably more often than not, just because. Okay, so yeah, Snowy suggests with half pot, which is what I went with. With a half pot strategy, definitely checking more often than not. This is because you definitely want to keep yourself somewhat uncapped on future streets. If I'm always just checking back with hands that are like pocket 8s, pocket 9s here, stuff that I may have missed with, such as like, maybe ace queen, for example, or something, I don't want to be so capped on the turn and river to where he can just blow me off of my range. So I do want to have some of these overpairs that don't need as much protection. I think jacks and aces are c-bets more often than not, simply because aces, you just get too much value out of them. Jacks need a little bit more protection, so I think I would go ahead and bet those. I think kings and queens, though, definitely fall into a check back, or into my check back range. I would say at least half the time. Now, the reason I say that is I think that with this specific opponent, he does tend to get a little more sticky than most players. So I think there's a little more value in betting most times. So I do go ahead and bet, though, and that is right at least some of the time. He calls, turns the 4 spades, as I said. He checks, and I decide to check behind this time. And you can see that this is going to be a mixed strategy if I go with half pot, which I do think I probably would more often than not. Now, with half pot, that could leave me with maybe not quite as much as I would want on the river if I want to have a nice balanced range of bluffs and value bets. Although I think if I do bet half pot here and then I end up having, maybe that or a little bit less than that, as far as my river bet goes. As far as sizing goes, I think it's okay just as long as I do remain balanced essentially on the river. So I do think this is a spot to definitely check sometimes, though. This card doesn't really favor my range as much as it does his. I don't think that he has a lot of hands like necessarily. I mean, I don't think he really has straights at this point. I don't really think he has 8-6 suited all that often, if ever. I don't think he has a ton of two-pair combos. So this is somewhat of a brick, but the thing is, it does favor him a little bit being out of position simply because the nuts really haven't changed at this point, because I just don't think 8-6 is really in either of our ranges all that often. I'm not saying we both can't have those. I could certainly 3-bet that sometimes, and he could open that hand in early position and call it sometimes, but I think we rarely have those combos. So I do think, as far as what we're talking about the nuts, whether it's overpairs or like 10x stuff, the 4 doesn't really change much, and that will favor him because dynamic cards, they will definitely shift the equity usually in favor of the player in position, just because he can play more freely and tougher with more info than opposed to the player that's out of position. So I do think this should be a mix, and I decided to go check this time. And the river was a very beautiful king of spades. He goes ahead and checks. And so now it's kind of interesting to talk about what type of sizing I should use here. I think that you could argue it a few different ways. If I had hands like, let's say, 6-5 of hearts, or something like maybe ace-jack of diamonds, ace-jack of spades, and I ended up on the river this way, I think that I probably would want to fire large and capitalize on a little bit more fold equity than I think I should have, as I think this player may find a fold with some stuff like maybe 9s or 8s sometimes. He is a good hand reader, though, and he may come to the realization that he may have to defend with those at least some of the time. So I do think it's an interesting spot to talk about what I would do with my bluffs, what I would do with other hands that maybe, obviously aren't as good. Like if I have king, queen, or ace, king, does that fall into a large bet sizing? I think you can go a few different ways, like I said. I decided, though, to bet essentially pot. I think I bet, or maybe I didn't bet quite pot, maybe like 3/4 pot. I think I bet something like 230. And he thought about it for a little bit and ended up folding. But I do think if I go with this sizing, I need to make sure that in the future of this opponent, if I do decide to size it up, I need to have the right amount of combos of bluffs here. In theory, I would like to have a ratio of about 2-to-1 as far as value hands to bluffs go. So this is where, if you guys are doing hand reviews at home and you're kind of going over stuff like combinatrix, if you're getting into more advanced game theory, then you definitely want to come up with which combos are you value betting with this sizing, and do you have enough bluffs to essentially balance out those value combos. So this was a pretty interesting hand. I hope you guys got a little bit out of it. I hope that on the flop and turn, you saw that you shouldn't just be blindly going nuts with your overpairs, because if you do that, then your checking range or your check back range is going to be very weak and very, you can be exploited very much so. So I do think it's important to talk about balancing your checking back or your check back range with some overpairs like kings and queens in the spot. But yeah, pretty interesting hand. Let's move on to the PLO hand real quick here. Okay, so I open King 10, 9, 6 single suit on the button. It is a 50-cent $1 game. I open for $3 on the button. I usually open pot in the first 3 spots here and then size it down just a little bit on the button, essentially because I want to open a wider range, so it makes sense to use a little bit smaller of a sizing. And my opponent in the big blind decides to 3-bet. Now, where I think players have a misconception about PLOs, they think that if they're in position, they can call every single 3-bet. You need to be very careful of this. You need to be very careful of just calling with any double-suited hand that's, really disconnected. This hand is, I think, just good enough. I think it has enough connectivity, and it's just good enough against an opponent that I thought was not like only ace-ace and king-king heavy. If that was the case, this might be an exploitative fold, but I felt like he could be opening some rundowns that were possibly worse than this. Maybe I think he had a little bit of a better understanding of the dynamic between myself and his, our range interaction that's going to be a little bit wider with me being on the button and him in the big blind. So as you can see, according to Poker Juice, and I have his range is basically 3-betting 6% of hands. I'm doing well enough in position. I'm getting the right price to continue here, so I do go ahead and continue. And the flop comes queen, queen, 6, and my opponent decides to fire out for about half pot. And I decide to raise him small in this spot, and I want to show you guys a little bit show you basically why I decided to do this. I think that most opponents that 3-bet, and when they see these paired boards where it's pretty much a lockdown board, I think that they figure opponents aren't defending well enough on these boards. If you guys have any kind of experience with stars, like poker stars, or if you have any kind of experience in mid to high stakes PLO games or any games where opponents are very competent, these boards get attacked quite often. Opponents know that these are the types of boards to attack where opponents have trouble defending and figuring out, how much of the range is really supposed to be defending, on this kind of lockdown texture. So what I did was essentially split his range into bet calls and then bet folds, because I do think that most opponents are betting close to 100% frequency as far as their C-bets on this board texture. So I have him bet calling with kings plus, and then I have him bet folding the rest of his combos. And I think that makes sense. It could be a little bit off, but I think in general it makes sense for sure. I think what my combo has going for it, and this is where we're going to talk about, you guys can see up here, proximity blockers. Now, what I mean by that is combos that in this situation are like king 10-9, or if I had something like ace jack 10, these Broadway types of rundowns, even though this is a little bit weaker of a rundown, I wouldn't call it much of a rundown, they block kind of indirectly queen X hands that he could have, simply because a lot of his 3-bets are going to be rundowns that if he has a queen, he's going to contain these cards in them. So if I have the king 10 and 9, that definitely lowers the probability of him having a queen in his hand. So yes, I don't have a queen in my hand. I don't directly block the queen, but in a sense, I have some proximity blockers, cards that are around the queen that he would have when he 3-bets. So I do think that I block trips a little bit. Having the 6 obviously is pretty good blocking any kind of underfold that he could have. So I do think it's a nice spot to go ahead and raise. And, opponents may even overfold in the spot, like some combos of ace-ace or king-king that are real, dry and disconnected, that don't have a lot going for them. Combos that they don't feel like they want to call now and then call off their stacks on future streets. So I do think this is a fairly accurate representation. As you guys can see, his bet folding range, I have him basically bet folding 37% of the time. If you add that into my actual raw equity, this becomes a very profitable play. And I don't like calling. I think you can argue a float, but I think it just pays to be more aggressive, especially in the lower stakes games where I think opponents just give you credit. I think they look at this flop texture and say, well, what is he really bluffing with here? I think this is just me being able to make an exploitative fold versus a guy that should have queen X plus pretty much almost every time. For that reason, I like sizing it down. I think this is another misconception in PLO where players think that they just have to pot it every single time they make a bet. This texture is really dry. And if I do want to bluff on this texture, I want to be able to do it for a pretty cheap price. And I also want to keep him kind of wide and keep him in the hand if I do have some nuttish combos that I'm raising with. So I think this makes a lot of sense to size it around this amount. And I think that having the proximity blockers, having the direct 6 blocker, makes this a very attractive play to where I can barrel with equity a lot of times. If, for example, I pick up something like an ace or, maybe a king, jack, that type of thing. So I do think that this is a profitable move based on how I ranged him. And if you guys have any questions or comments about the no limit hand or the PLO hand here, go ahead and let me know as always. Until next time, this is Nick from Arch City Poker. Take care.